Good evening, and welcome to Quizbowl Roundtable's first podcast. My name is Noah Prince. I will be running this webinar. The point of this webinar is to start off giving a little bit of the story about Quizbowl Roundtable and what we're aiming to do, and hopefully give you some advice that you can use when coaching your team. So first off, just how this is going to work. I have audio and video turned off. You can only watch and listen to me right now, but everyone is free to type questions. I will try and address them later. I have volume turned off on my side so that there's no feedback or any sort of loop there. I will be reading your comments in the question and answer, and I will get to them eventually. We'll save some time for that at the end. I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited about this project. When we opened up Quizbowl Roundtable, we invited a number of affiliates to invite all of their friends and coaches to see if they might want to join our site. And I got a great response. And I'm really excited to see so many people interested in what we're offering, especially all of the new coaches. I had a lot of people sign up saying that they were brand new coaches. They were looking for whatever advice they could get. And I've been there before, and I know what you're feeling. I started my current position teaching at the Illinois Math and Science Academy in 2008. And the very next year, there was a vacancy for a Scholastic Bowl coach. And I had played Scholastic Bowl when I was in school. And so some students approached me and asked me to be the coach. And not knowing any better, I agreed. And I found myself not really knowing what I was supposed to be doing. My predecessor had left the academy, so I didn't really have anyone to train me. All I really had in terms of resources was a large cabinet, 6 feet tall, a few feet wide. And it was absolutely full of practice materials, old trophies, things like that, buzzer systems, of course. And I really didn't know where to get started with that at all. So I spent literally weeks going through trying to figure out what is it I'm even looking at? What do I need to run this team? I found all different types of questions ranging from, way too low level for our students to ACF regionals, college sets that were too hard for my students at the time. And I didn't know any better just looking at the questions, which were which. So I kind of struggled through my first year. I also had some issues signing up for tournament, on a practice, figuring out how to get students to study. So I've been there and had all of these struggles. And I'm excited now that we can build this site and have a coaching community that helps welcome new coaches and gives them the tools that they need to succeed. All right. So I'd like to start talking a little bit about the questions that I got. When I opened up the invitations to my affiliates, and I said, to my affiliates all over the country, these are just Quizbowl acquaintances I knew. I said, invite coaches who you think might be interested in this sort of product, and let's see what their needs are. And what I heard a lot of is questions about, well, how do you practice? How do you study? There are lots of aspects of coaching Quizbowl. There's running tournaments, there's running practices, of course, studying, team building, recruiting, fundraising, all sorts of things that go into Quizbowl coaching. But it seems like the biggest pain point, the biggest points of frustration, where I'm getting the most questions is about practicing and how to study. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to tell you what I do in terms of practicing, at least. I have some advice to give about studying, in fact, and that's a lot of what we're going to be doing at Quizbowl Roundtable, is talking about how to study, how to get your students studying, giving them the tips that they might need to be more successful, and we'll break it down category by category. I hope nobody came here today thinking that they were going to leave knowing how to get their students to study. If there was a formula that I could give you in 30 minutes, well, everyone would be a lot better at Quizbowl. The fact of the matter is that's a very difficult subject. It works in team dynamics, psychology, individual students' interests, recruiting. There's so many aspects to getting studying to work right. So it's going to take us some time to address that question, but we've got a lot of time at Quizbowl Roundtable. You can expect to see regular blogs that address these questions, so we will be able to share our tips eventually. What I'd like to do today is talk about how to practice. So I saw a number of questions come in from coaches who were signing up for the webinar. A number of questions came in saying, well, how do you practice? What can you do besides just reading questions to your students? And let me start off by saying reading questions for your students is a great thing to do. In fact, if you only ran practices by reading questions to students, I don't think you would necessarily be wrong. After all, our students like playing Quizbowl. That's why they're there. Reading questions will expose them to some new, or definitely doing. But if you want some variety, or if you're just curious if there are some other ways to do things, well, there are some ways you can go. So I have heard of people doing things like study practices. I've heard people use that term before, where a team kind of gets in the same room and they study together. I'm not really a big fan of that because personally that doesn't sound like the sort of practice I would want to go to, and I think it'd be hard to keep students interested. There will be other people who disagree with me on that, but for my sake, I didn't want to get people in the same room to study when we could be getting together and actually bonding as a team by playing some Quizbowl. I've also seen practices where students present material or coaches present material for the students to learn. I think that's great as a teacher, from a teaching standpoint. I think that's a great way to help student standpoint. Again, I find that a little bit inefficient because what you're doing is you're taking all of your players and you're having them learn the same thing at the same time and at a rather slow pace. I think you get more bang for your buck if you let students study what they're interested in, as opposed to making them all study the same thing. So on the whole, I'm just not a big fan of study practices, and I didn't really use them very much. One technique I used that I was a really big fan of, though, was making sure that I was playing some Quizbowl with my teams. And so what are the advantages of that? Well, I think it's important to understand the history of my team a little bit. As I mentioned, I started coaching in the fall of 2009, and I was the head coach at the Illinois Math and Science Academy for 5 years. And so I stepped down in the spring of 2014. I stepped down to be assistant coach, and then this year I've stepped down again. I am a freelancer, I suppose. I'm still involved in Quizbowl projects. I'm still writing tournaments. Working on some software projects, obviously working with Quizbowl Roundtable. So I'm involved with the community, just not from a coaching standpoint, not coaching my own team, that is. When I first started, as I mentioned, I really didn't know what I was doing, how to practice, how to study. It got a bit late in the year, and I knew I needed to kind of ramp things up for the following year. I knew we had a competitive team. We had done really well on the Frosh Soft circuit and the JV circuit. And so I knew we had a really good chance to do well at the varsity level during my second year coaching. And so at the end of my first year, I was already planning ahead to that a little bit. And so one of the things I was able to do that spring that I found really helpful was start playing some of my players one-on-one. Now, this might sound a little bit odd, but I had been out of Scholastic Bowl for a number of years at that point. And compared to how good our students are today, I was never really any good. So when I first started playing against my players, well, I wasn't very competitive, I'll just put it that way. I didn't know a whole lot, and I'd forgotten a lot of the science and things like that I had known in high school. And so I just wasn't very good. But the point wasn't for me to be good. The point was that I wanted my players to feel good about their own games. And so when I have a student who is studying and could see that, well, just with a little bit of studying, I can beat somebody twice my age who's been a part of academia and intellectual circles for all this time, it really shows that firsthand. From me, what I gained most from it was having a better sense of where my players were. When you put all of your players in one room and read questions to them all together, there's a huge shadow effect. You don't necessarily know what one person knows because somebody else might know the question slightly before them, and then you don't really know the full strengths of your team. When I started watching my players play one-on-one, I got a much better sense of how broad my players' knowledge was, and then how I could build teams around them, right? I wasn't just necessarily thinking about one of my players as a literature player. I knew that he's really good at literature and also pretty good at Greek mythology, apparently. So if I want to build a team, I know that I can count on him for the Greek mythology as well. So by getting a chance to work with my players one-on-one, I got to get a better assessment of where my players stood. I also think there's a lot of value in making sure that you're playing as a coach, that you play Quizbowl occasionally. As a teacher, when students ask me, for example, I teach mathematics. When students are having trouble learning formulas or applying formulas, I try and remind them about how learning happens. I mean, when somebody first learns a skill, it might sort of make sense. They might recognize it, but they don't necessarily know how to produce that with that skill. And I think the same thing happens in Quizbowl. A lot of times in Quizbowl, you'll hear clues that will trigger some sort of recognition for you, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can answer a question. And that happens a lot with beginners. They'll recognize words that they've heard before, but not necessarily know how to say those words to get points. So one of the things we have to do, and one of the important benefits of practice, is getting players a chance to recognize a clue they've heard and produce the answer, because the next time that answer line comes up, they're going to be more confident in answering it. I think the same thing goes for coaches. Coaches will recognize clues that they've heard over and over and over again. There are a number of stories I've heard about coaches who say to their players, "How come you didn't get that question on that clue? We knew that clue." And then the players would respond, "Well, what was the answer?" And the coach would say, "Oh, well, I don't know." That's a great way to lose credibility with your students. If you now, I'm not saying that a coach needs to be the smartest person in the room, far from it, but it helps make the point that students can learn from exposure and studying if the coaches have done the same thing. So other than those sort of one-on-one practices, what else can you be doing? Well, I try and think about this in terms of another sport, like, for example, basketball. In basketball, do they just practice by playing basketball? Well, you probably do a lot of that, but there's other aspects of the game that you could be practicing individual skills, right? There's passing, there's free throws, there's setting up an offensive scheme, there are defensive drills, layup drills. There are all sorts of drills that focus on individual particular skills. Does that sort of thing exist in Quizbowl? Yes, but I think it's much more limited. What sort of skills can we isolate and practice individually? Well, we don't really have defensive schemes. We don't really have offensive schemes. We pretty much just answer questions. At the same time, though, there are some individual skills we can work on. I think one of the easiest to see is working on bonuses. During bonus questions, players get to work with their teammates to come up with the answer. But they generally don't have a lot of time to do that. So I find that one of the most important skills to work on with newer players is get time conferring and bonuses appropriately. A lot of times I'll start off with players that when they first come in at their first practice, I read them their first bonus, kind of look around, not knowing the answer for 5 seconds. And then maybe I'll give them the answer and they'll say, "Oh, well, I thought it was that." Well, you've got to say something. In Quizbowl, you only get points if you actually say the answer. So we need to work with students, especially young ones, with saying the answer in the first place. But then there's another battle beyond that, because eventually you'll get to the point where, maybe a player doesn't know the answer outright, but has a pretty decent idea and maybe needs to bounce it off of a teammate first. Well, a lot of times players start off a little bit timid, so they'll wait for 3 or 4 seconds and then start to try conferring. By the time they've said anything, they've run out of time on that bonus. So a lot of what we have to do with players is going to get them used to give your answer sooner. As soon as the moderator stops, you need to start running ideas past people, let them know if you've got any clue, anything like that. In fact, I even try and coach my players, or I used to try and start conferring while the moderator is still reading. If you have an idea what the question, where the question is going, whisper it unobtrusively to the person next to you and see if they nod along or not. That's dangerous in some sense, though, because if you're whispering to somebody next to you, then you risk not hearing the rest of the question, and that's something we also had to work on. but it's one of those skills that you have to get good at, especially if you're playing at the high levels, and especially if you're playing NEQT tournaments where timing isn't quite as generous as it is in, for example, the Illinois State format. So working in bonuses is another key skill. But there's another one I think is overlooked, which is how we work on toss-ups. Now, how do you win a toss-up battle? The easy answer is you've got to know a lot of things. The more things you know, the more clues you know, the earlier you're going to recognize the clues in a toss-up and be able to buzz in and get the answer. So if somebody wants to get better at toss-ups, it's very easy to say, well, the solution then is to just go learn more things. If you learn more things, you'll get. But I think that's missing the point. So one of the best practices I ever ran was in the spring of 2012. Now, during that year, we were actually having a pretty good year. The previous year, we had won the Illinois State title. And then in 2012, we were right at the top of the state of Illinois again, along with Rockford Auburn, and we were gearing up for the national tournaments. And based on the results we had seen and based on where we stood in the Fred Moreland's national rankings, we knew we had a shot at the title, even if we weren't favorites by any means, but we had more than a 0% chance of winning, and I wanted to prepare to the best of our ability. So what I did was, for some reason, I had it in my head that we needed to be better at getting toss-ups earlier. Now, in retrospect, that was a silly thing for me to think, because we had several tournaments that year where we powered more than half the questions we heard. That's not just we powered more than half the questions that we converted. We averaged more than 10 toss-ups out of 20 that we powered, not to mention the other toss-ups we got, not to mention what the other team got. So we were getting toss-ups really early that year, very consistently. But of course, we were gearing up for the higher level competition. We know we had to worry about Bellarmine. We knew we had to worry about Hunter College. We knew there were other schools that would give us some trouble, and so we were preparing for them. So I knew I wanted my team to be more aggressive on toss-ups. So I talked to them and I said, I really just don't think we're aggressive enough to win those really competitive matches that we're going to have to play at the end. And I don't think they quite believed me. They said, how can we really do any better at that? So I sort of did this experiment. I said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out this NEQT set. It was power marked. And so I said, I'm just going to read the power portion of every question to you, and we're going to see how you do. And at the beginning, this was sort of a disaster. I'd read them the power portion of a question. I'd say, okay, you've got to give me your answer now. What is it? And a lot of times they just sort of stare and say, well, we don't know yet. It's a hard question. Okay, so I had to try and prove my point that this was actually a worthwhile exercise. And so what I did was I read the next question again. They didn't really feel like they had any knowledge to go by there. So I tried to break it down for them. I said, okay, let's look at the context clues that are in the power question, in the power clues. You're not necessarily going to recognize something for sure, but you can get enough context that you'll have a pretty darn good idea. And once I sort of explained that method and I went through about 4 or 5 toss-ups like that with them, then they started to see what I meant and they started to believe me, and it was working. They were at the end, I'd say, okay, well, what do you think the answer is? And they normally had it down to just 1 or 2, and they were normally right. So this was a really effective technique. So I'd like to show you how I break down questions like that. All right. So I'm going to be sharing with you a little PowerPoint here. Let's see. Oh, sorry. Okay. So what I'm showing you right now are some toss-ups from a set called Delta Burke, which it was written in 2013. It's a set that's produced for the sort of introductory college level. It's produced each year down in Florida. And although it's produced for college level, a lot of the questions are not that much different from what you would see in high school. And so what I want to do is look at these questions and talk about what sort of context we can get from just the first two sentences, and then I'll show you the rest of the questions and we can see, well, how we did. So here's a question. It starts off, a 15th century holder of this position is the namesake of a fallacy known as Morton's fork, in which contradictory arguments lead to the same conclusion. That alone, I can tell you I've never heard of Morton's fork, so if I had to go by pure knowledge, I would not be getting this question. Although I think I've got a pretty good idea what the answer is. Now, why? Well, I look at something like a 15th century holder of this position. Well, if you're talking in those sort of terms, then this must be a position that's existed for a long time and continued to exist for a while. So what sort of positions could that be? Well, it's not going to be the leader of a modern government. It might be something like the king of a European country, potentially something like Emperor of China. What sort of answers could we have that are positions that would have been held long ago and for a long period of time? But then we hear something about a fallacy. Okay, well, when we hear about a fallacy, we're starting to think, well, this has to be something philosophical, right? So a lot of those things we were thinking about, kings, emperors, things like that, well, that probably wouldn't be the case if they were discussing a philosophical fallacy. And then when I hear the word Morton's fork, I certainly think Morton sounds like an English name. So I'm thinking, what's a position that would have been around in the 15th century and for a long time in which English people would be serving and they would be discussing something philosophical? Well, philosophy and religion were probably hand in hand in the 15th century. So what's a British religious leader? You'd probably think Archbishop of Canterbury is a pretty good guess here. And that's just from the first sentence. Now, would I be buzzing here with Archbishop of Canterbury? Probably not, unless it's a really competitive game and I need this toss-up. But otherwise, I'll probably be content to listen to another clue. So now I get another clue. The first holder of this position was sent on a mission to establish it by Pope Gregory the Great and was named Augustine. All right, now before we weren't sure this was a religious leader. We thought it might be because of the tie-in with philosophy, but now we're pretty darn sure this is a religious leader. I would say that Archbishop of Canterbury is our very best guess. Now we can go and listen to the rest of the question. And they talk more about, okay, a more recent holder of this position. Then they mention Thomas a Becket, and certainly they eventually get to this as the leader of the Anglican Church. All right, so this actually is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, I did not know either of those first two clues for sure, but putting it together with the context, Archbishop of Canterbury was really the only thing I could have thought it would have been after the first sentence, and certainly by the end of the second one. So that's how the context clues can really help us put this together and get earlier buzzes, even where we don't have perfect knowledge. Let's look at a couple more of these. So the next question starts, Albert Luthuli reprimanded this man for a speech he gave at Freedom Square in Sophiatown. Now this one I think also points exactly to one answer. Why is this? Well, Albert Luthuli, especially when you see it spelled out, looks a lot like an African name. When you hear it for the first time, because questions are read to the players, when you hear it, you might not think that, but when you see it, it certainly looks African. But still, it sounds pretty African to me anyway. Reprimanded this man for a speech he gave at Freedom Square in Sophiatown. Okay, well, there's a place in, where would a place called Sophiatown be located? The fact that the city name ends in town makes you think that it's got to be someplace where they speak English. And where would they say something like Sophia in the name? It's probably not Australia. Australia has a lot of Aboriginal influence in their place names. It doesn't sound like America, because what town would we name in America after Sophia? When you put together that it sounded like we started with an African name and then we ended with a city name like Sophia, I really think we're in South Africa here. So it sounds to me, when I hear this first sentence, like, okay, we're talking about a South African man. Now, just based on that information, you can probably guess the most famous South African man who could be coming up here is probably Nelson Mandela. Are there other South Africans who could come up? Potentially, but especially when we're talking about something like Freedom Square, this sounds like Nelson Mandela. In the next sentence, we hear this man declared, "I am the first accused," while defending his actions as a member of the Umkhonto with Sizwe in the "I am prepared to die" speech. Okay, so we find out that he's the first accused, meaning he stood trial. And Nelson Mandela famously stood trial because he got sentenced to Robben Island for 27 years. So after I hear "I'm the first accused," I was actually playing this match at an open tournament in the Chicago area. That's exactly where I buzzed, and I said, "This just absolutely has to be Nelson Mandela, because who else could it be?" And surely enough, it was Nelson Mandela. Now, I did not know either of those first two clues from the beginning. In fact, the first time I would have known for sure that this was Nelson Mandela off of a clue I recognized was the "I am prepared to die" speech. But I buzzed before that even happened because I figured out the context. We can do the same thing. I went through round by round of this tournament. Look at this question. The system of permits regulating the trade in this commodity by the French was called conge, and traders in it included coureurs de bois and voyageurs. At this point, I don't have a strong sense, but what I recognize is this is a commodity that the French dealt with. Well, they dealt with a lot of things. They had an empire. There are lots of places this could go. I don't recognize any of those clues, but I'm remembering that this is a French commodity. In the next sentence, we hear something about the Hudson's Bay Company was chartered for trade in this commodity. Now, you might recognize that clue. What that tells me is Hudson's Bay Company means we're in Canada. And so we're not talking about just any French trade. We're talking about a French-Canadian trade. And to me, that screams the fur trade. Sure enough, this is fur. Next toss-up. This event makes use of a garment consisting of 2 sheets of unhemmed white cloth known as the ihram. Now, I don't recognize this clue, and this could be a lot of things. Where would you wear a white garment? Well, it could be a funeral, for example. It could be a wedding. It could be a lot of things. But I do notice the fact that since I said the word ihram, I should probably be thinking that this is most likely going to be some sort of an event in which Muslims take part. Let's look at the next sentence. One rite during this event is performed from Jamarat Bridge. Right, so if I already thought that we were talking about an event that Muslims took part in, and now I say that it takes place at a very specific bridge called Jamarat Bridge, what could it be? Could it be a funeral? No, because those take place all over the world. Could this be a wedding? No, again, those take place everywhere. This has to be a specific event that Muslims take part in that happens at a very specific location. What else could it be but the Hajj? It's not going to be something like prayer. Again, people do that anywhere. The only time they necessarily all come together is during Hajj. So I would say that Hajj. Now, I actually happen to Amarat Bridge is where the stoning of the devil takes place, and so that is a very famous sub-event inside the Hajj. But you wouldn't necessarily have to know that clue exactly in order to put those pieces together. Let's look at just a couple more of these. Santhara is a specific type of this action that is acceptable for the most extremely devout Jains. All right, I have no idea what Santhara is, but I do know that Jains are very well known for being extremely pacifist and extremely nonviolent. So if we're talking about an action that's acceptable for the most extremely devout Jains, then this kind of seems like an exceptional thing, right? This isn't something that all Jains do. This is perhaps something that only certain ones get to do. So it's outside of the normal behavior. So this isn't quite nonviolent. It's probably somehow violent, but not in an unacceptable way. When Buddhist scripture suggests this action is acceptable for an arhat who has obtained nibbana or consciousness, but not for the unenlightened, as this action adds to the negative karma in the next life. All right, so this is a controversial thing, right? It produces negative karma. What could this be? Well, this could be committing any sort of crime, except that Jains wouldn't say that it's acceptable to commit certain types of crime, right? At least not crimes against others. They're nonviolent, they're pacifist. So we'd have to think that if it's a crime that's being committed, it's got to be a crime against the self. And so what's a really good guess for a crime against the self that could be the answer here? Well, I think suicide is a great guess. Sure enough, when we look at the rest of the question, they were going for suicide. Now, I probably wouldn't have been buzzing right at the end of the second sentence, but if somebody else buzzed and got it right. If they were on the other team, I'd have been really upset because I'd have known I had a chance at that question. I could have put the pieces together, even though I didn't know for sure what the answer was. All right, let's look at just one more example of this. So this one comes from Science. One test of this theory involved measuring the periastron time of the Hulse-Taylor binary pulsar, and another used gyroscopes to measure the geodetic drift rate. All right, you know what? I don't even think I need another sentence here. So what we're being told is this is a theory that involves stars. So what sort of theories do we know about space? Well, certainly there's the Big Bang theory, but another one is general relativity, which looks at, for example, the effect of mass over large portions of space, for example. There are lots of experiments in general relativity that look at stars and how the light from stars bends. And so I actually have no idea what a Hulse-Taylor binary pulsar is, but the fact that we were talking about a theory that was measured by looking at an individual star makes me think this is probably general relativity again. I would have buzzed in there with general relativity and been correct. Now, is this a perfect method? Could I have thought it was general relativity and had the answer been Big Bang theory? Yes, that will happen sometimes. My point is not that this is a foolproof way of getting toss-ups. My point is that by looking at the first sentence or two of a toss-up, you can often get context clues so strong that you'll know the answer down to one or two potential answers with a pretty strong leaning towards what ends up being correct. So when I did my practice where I only read the first few sentences to my students, just the power portion of the toss-ups, and they saw how powerful this was, I think it changed the way they listened to toss-ups. Instead of listening to wait for something they recognized, they were actively thinking about each clue they heard and trying to put that into a context. And it's incredibly powerful. My player, Andrew Salee, who graduated this last year and was a member of Team Illinois, so he was one of the best players in the state last year, he told me that the majority of the buzzes he got when playing Quizbowl were not from direct knowledge, but from the majority came from putting together context clues correctly. So anyway, I think this is a great practice method. I would recommend it to anyone who's trying to get an edge in buzzing on their toss-ups. So that's it as far as practice methods. There are, of course, other practice methods, but I'm only telling you the ones that I use that I thought were really effective. And so these are all methods that I would use every year. Most of my practices, the majority of my practices were actually just reading questions and simulating matches. But when I felt the need to deviate, I generally stuck to one of the ones I told you about. Now, that concludes what I wanted to say as far as how to run practices. We will have more advice throughout the year at quizbowlroundtable.com. If you like what you've been seeing, if you found this advice helpful, there's plenty more where that came from. We spent the summer putting together a team of players. Players and coaches, people who were experts at some aspect of Quizbowl. The player I mentioned earlier, Andrew Salee, he is doing some work for us. He's putting together some advice on how to study geography, and especially in how studying geography can help you become a stronger player in, say, history. We've also got Eric Shu, formerly of Western Albemarle. He's now going to college in Virginia. He's working with us on how to study history, and he's putting together some guides on how he studies history. So what sort of things to focus on to study and as a player. We've also got on our team Adam Silverman. He went to high school at Centennial in Georgia, led that team to a third-place finish at Pace Nationals in 2012, and now he goes to Georgia Tech. He's working a little bit for us on how to study science. And then we've got some coaches in the mix. So we've got Coach Joshua Rutsky of Hoover High School in Alabama. He's past president of the Alabama Scholastic Bowl Coaches Association. And he's also an English teacher. So he's got some things to share with us about how to study English and drama, things like that. And then I'm really excited. We've got Jason Flowers, the coach of LASA, the premier scholastic bowl program in the country. He's got 5 national titles all in the last few years. He got second place at PACE, NSC, NAQT High School National Championship Tournament, and National History Bean Bowl last year. So you can always find his teams at the very top of the very hardest tournaments. He'll be working with us a little bit too, sharing some of his advice. And of course, I'll be sharing whatever I can. I'm not actively coaching anymore, but I coached the Illinois Math and Science Academy to 9 state titles during my time there in the IHSA format, which was our local format, but also NAQT format and some National History Bowl. And my teams have also finished in the top 4 at PACE NSC, the National Scholastic Competition, High School National Championship Tournament from NAQT, and National History Bean Bowl. So, and we're still building the team. So I'm really excited with all the people we've got together and about all that they can offer. If you like what you've been seeing, though, what you should do is go join quizbowlroundtable.com, become a member. If you found your way here, that's probably because you received an email from one of our affiliates inviting you to this webinar. So if that's the case, then please look at the email they sent you for instructions on how to sign up. If you're seeing this, if you're not seeing this live, if you're seeing this as a replay, then you probably did not get an affiliate email, in which case you can just go to quizbowlroundtable.com and there'll be information there for how you can join the site. Just a reminder about what sort of services we offer. The most basic membership at quizbowlroundtable.com with that, our blog and all of our downloadables and videos, media, that sort of thing. You can expect the blogs to be updated at least every week. We've been producing blogs all summer long, actually, and so there are actually a few already up. I've already posted something about my beginning of year checklist, and Joshua Rutsky's posted something about how he gets started to the year and what he's thinking about. And we'll just continue to add to that all season long. We'll also be putting up some downloadables and some media, so things like video content. We're planning to put together some software packages to help you run tournaments, because personally, when I was coaching, running tournaments was one of the most annoying parts of the job. I wanted to be working with my team, not running tournaments for other people. And I felt like running tournaments was kind of a time sink. I spent a lot of time writing up documents, schedules, and things like that to run the tournament. And it's necessary, right? Quiz Bowl doesn't run without tournaments, but that's not where I wanted to be spending my time. So now that I'm on the other side, I'm trying to put together some resources to make running tournaments as efficient as we possibly can, so that it doesn't waste any more of your coach's time. You can spend your coach's time actually coaching your team. If you want more than that, if you've enjoyed this webinar and you want access to more of them, we'll be running these webinars every quarter. So if you want to be a part of those, then you can step up to our next level of membership. That's the elite membership. Or sorry, that's the plus membership. If you want to go beyond that, we offer one-on-one mentoring on top of everything you've already heard. This one-on-one mentoring could be great if you are trying to take your team to the next level from wherever they are. If you want to get yourself a really good head start into a strong coaching career, if you're very new in your career, or if you found yourself with a team that's starting to be really competitive at a high level and you want to make sure that you know how to close the deal, how to secure the championships, well, we've got some people who can help you with that. So if you're interested in the one-on-one mentoring, then you'll want to sign up for our elite member package. All right. So with all of that, I just want to say thank you very much for showing up and for watching our webinar. And for the next few minutes, I will stick around and answer whatever questions I can for you. You are free to type them into the box. It should be on the right side of your screen. I'll give you a minute to do that, and then I will answer them. All right. I'm seeing a question here that said you talked about team dynamics earlier. Can you talk about how students can work together outside of practices? I think that's a great question. I think there's a lot that can be done there. Uh, what should students be doing outside of practices? Well, my model is that we practice to get better at team skills, and they should be becoming better individual players on their own time. I still expect them to study as part of the team, but they don't necessarily have to do it in front of me. What can students do outside together to outside of practices? Well, I do actually think it's valuable for students to study together, not during our practice time, and I've advocated that in the past. I've told my players, you know, if you're going to study for 2 hours and somebody else is going to study for 2 hours, why don't you get in the same room and study for those 2 hours together? It's not that one person studying is necessarily going to give the other person any more knowledge, but I think it's important because it helps build the kind of trust of the team. When you're working alone, like let's say you lock yourself in a library for a couple hours and you study very hard, it's easy to get frustrated and annoyed, and especially if you feel like your teammates aren't doing the same. If you can look across the table and see that your teammate is still going strong, I think it helps energize you and trust in them a little bit more. And so I've been an advocate of studying together outside of practice. I think that's a great team building activity. All right. Well, it looks like those are all the questions we've got for right now. If you have more, though, what you should do is email those questions to quizbowlroundtable@gmail.com, and then I and my team will get to work trying to answer them for you as thoroughly as we can and to the best of our ability. And you can expect to see the answers either in a future webinar or in a later blog or something of that nature. So please do send your questions. These are great, and I love the conversations that they're starting. But for now, I will call that an end to our first webinar. Thank you very much for attending. I hope it pays off. Have a great season.